welcome back to PA Chalk Up. I'm your host Manny, and today we have Marco. Hi, Marco. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
It's all good. It's a pleasure to have you. But for those who don't know who you are, if you just give us a little introduction to who you are, what you do, and how you got to where you are. Have you ever wondered how I'm able to run my business, my podcast, and still be able to coach? Well, I use TeamBuildr. TeamBuildr is an all in one coaching software that reduces the amount of time that we spend on the back end of programming, on our Google Sheets, on our Excels, and allows me more freedom to do testing. With this podcast and episodes, I'm actually able to run some programs that I learned through different coaches coming on. To find out how you can use TeamBuildr and how it can apply to your own program, visit the link in the description and catch yourself a 30-day free trial. Just simply use code PACHALKUP, that's PACHALQUP, and start the next stage of your coaching career.
Yeah, for sure. I'm the founder of HRV for Training, which is a small company developing tools to track heart rate variability in the context of our response to exercise. I have a background in computer science and engineering, a PhD in data science, and then another degree in sports science. So I try to combine the two worlds, the technology and the physiology, so that we can build tools that people can use effectively in their daily life and daily practice for athletes and coaches of all levels. That's more or less what I do. I do some teaching as well in Amsterdam. Help a few companies doing similar things like Aura and others I advise, and a bit of coaching as well of endurance athletes, in particular runners. I'd say that's pretty much it.
Perfect. So to start off with, how did you get involved with HRV and how did you start initially wanting to focus solely on how that implements and how that benefits athletes training?
Yeah, so I would say 15 years ago, I was fortunate to have the opportunity to go. At that time, I was back in Italy to go abroad in the Netherlands, in particular, to a research institute in which they were developing the first prototypes of what now we call wearables. So sensors you could place on the body to measure the activity of the heart, the activity of your muscles, the activity of the brain. As a computer scientist, I found that extremely interesting, right? We were not just building software, but we were looking at what was happening in the body. And that, yeah, triggered an interest into this kind of applications. What can we do with these devices? And in those years, then it became easier also to do that with off-the-shelf sensors. So I could get a polar strap, I could build a mobile app to get the data, start looking at different parameters in different contexts. And yeah, I don't know if it was because I wasn't so good myself at managing stress or for other reasons, but that really sparked something. And I was really interested into what can we track heart activity and in particular resting physiology and heart rate variability in the context of our stress response, both for athletic purposes, but also for general life stress and the things we do and go through with our jobs and so on. And that's how it started. I would say about 12 years ago, I built the app, and then from there has been, I would say, a learning experience as well, because
Mm.
these things have evolved a bit. And I went back to study more the physiology side of things because I was coming only from a technology angle earlier. And so we keep learning and building and trying to understand how it all works out and how we can use this data effectively, which is not always as advertised, I would say.
Hmm. So again, going back to the advertisement, everyone is kind of tuning into the fact that HRV is a thing that we should track and measure. But if you give us an actual explanation on what HRV is and how it's currently getting used.
HRV, I'd say, let's start with this. When we track it properly, and we'll have to elaborate on this later, HRV is our best non-invasive marker of our body's stress response. That means that we can use it as a tool to track how we respond to training and lifestyle stressors. And that is something that we cannot really do in other non-invasive ways. We cannot measure
Mm.
stress, which is somewhat abstract entity, right? We cannot measure the autonomic nervous system directly, non-invasively. But the stress response through the autonomic nervous system impacts heart rate variability and even just heart rate. And that is something we can track. So if we measure at the right time, in the right way, then that becomes a useful data point of how we respond to stressors, which we can use for actionability, which actually I think is the most important thing, right? We need to do something with this data.
Mhm.
We can make adjustments to our training or to other things you're doing based on that data.
So, with the studies and research that you've done, how should it be getting used, and how should we accommodate for each day that we see the results obviously going up and down?
So in terms of how we acquire the data, typically we want to look at resting physiology. So we want to look at the data in a resting condition. But it's also important to remember that we want to look at the data far from stressors and far from other factors that might confound the data. And that means that typically we have two options. One is we measure throughout the night, and one is we measure first thing in the morning. So first thing in the morning, we would standardize our protocol, meaning that we wake up, we go to the bathroom if we need to go, come back, sit up, take our measurement. We do that before having breakfast, before coffee, before exercising, before all sorts of things that impact our physiology acutely. We don't want to measure the transitory effect of these stressors. We want to measure our baseline resting physiology so that we can compare day after day and see how things are changing in response to the various stressors. In the night, it's a similar thing. We are sleeping, we use a device typically that can measure as we sleep, and then we average the data throughout the night. So, in this context, I think we have two important differences to mention always when we think about the night measurement and the morning measurement that can help people also understand a bit better how this whole thing works. The first one is that obviously the night comes before the morning. So the night is typically more tightly coupled to the previous night, the previous evening, or previous day's stressors. It's just because it's earlier. And as I said at the beginning, we want to measure at rest, but we also want to measure far from stressors. Because if I just exercised, or if I went out last night, if I had some drinks, or if I had a very heavy dinner, like all these sort of things will impact my physiology for a few hours. And then the impact of these stressors will be gone. And by the time we measure in the morning, we might have renormalized our resting physiology. So when we measure in the night, typically we have a tightly coupled response, which is very tightly coupled again to the previous stressor more than to our readiness or recovery or action or what we can do on the following day. So the tools and the wearable sensors typically are used to give you these readiness scores and things like that. But in reality, they reflect more your previous behavior than your ability
Mm.
to perform on a given day. And that's because the measurement is a bit too close to the stressor, unless you have, a very uneventful, I would say, routine in the evening. Totally fine. Obviously, like the one I have, I eat rather early and then maybe I read something and then I go to bed. I don't drink alcohol, things like that. So in this case, the night data can be more similar to the morning data because there are no late evening stressors. But even if you just train in the evening, actually sometimes you do that, then you are measuring a bit too close to these stressors. And then you might be basically over penalized by the analysis of the data because it's just looking at what happens right after the stressor, while it is perfectly normal that physiology is altered when you exercise and do other things, and then you want to allow a few hours to see the normalization and then measure again. So night data typically reflects very well behavior. Morning data reflects better what you're going to do, what are you going to
Mhm.
be able to do, the stressors you could absorb on that given day. The other difference that I think is important, apart from the one of timing, is the one of body position. When you're sleeping, obviously you're lying down, so there's no way around that. That's what you're going to capture is the state of full rest, we can call it, where the parasympathetic nervous system is very active. When you wake up, it's a different state, and it's yet another different state when you sit up, for example, from a lying down position, because you create a short orthostatic stressor, it's called, when you change body position. And that makes it so that if you measure shortly after this change in position, the data is more sensitive to
Mm.
stress because basically you amplify the response, right? So if you're a bit sick and then you sit up, then your sitting heart rate will be much higher than it would be if you were not a bit sick. And where you were sleeping, maybe the difference is really minimal. So this is a way that makes the data more useful. And this type of protocol, you can do it only in the morning. So if we
Mm.
think about these two things, normally I would recommend to take a morning measurement because it's further away from the stressors and you can use the orthostatic stressor and the sitting up to capture a more sensitive data point that allows you to track well not only huge stressors but also your training response better, which is typically what we are interested in, more than rare events like sickness or having way too much alcohol. Like those are things that people mention when they use wearables. But obviously, we want to use the data for something a bit more interesting than that. And then, in the context of training in particular, I think the other protocol might be better. And of course, there's always practical implications. So if you in the morning, I don't know, have a very active routine, you have small children, all sorts of things that make it very difficult
Mm.
to do that, then for sure, use a night device and measure during the night. It's not that that is useless, but it's just probably not as good for athletes to track their physiological response.
Obviously, different session types have a different impact on the heart rate response. How would you recommend then taking that into account into the next day's session? So, for example, if I do a weightlifting session, my heart rate tends to come down quicker. There's less recovery time involved. But if I do like an extended session, there's more um, stress put on the heart. So there's less, the recovery time is longer. How do you then suggest we adjust our training or physical activity for that day to match with what we've previously done?
Normally, the way I would think about this is first in terms of what is HRV good at. And one thing is we cannot really make up the plan
Mm.
starting just with HRV value, right? Because this seems obvious, but it's how people often approach the technology. It's
Mm.
like, okay, now I have this tool. If everything is okay, I go hard and I do whatever is my exercise preference, but always, higher intensity and things like that. And then when the HRV is down, I will take it easy or rest. So that's not how things work. Also, because HRV is more or less sensitive to different type of stimulus, as also you noted in terms of the heart rate response to the type of session you do. And is also a marker of overall stress, right? Not just exercise stress. So the way we should use this is really starting with a plan. So either through a coach or your self coach, and you make up your plan and you alternate the stimulus and hard days, easy days, all the things that we know you've learned from years of sports science. And then you use HRV as a tool to make small adjustments based on how you responded to those stimulus. So if your HRV is suppressed in a day in which you have an intense session, the recommendation would be to scale down the intensity. So this is how the data is used also in HRV guided studies. That means that there is a plan and the plan is adjusted through HRV, but it is always done, typically I would say, maybe not always, but in most of the studies, in this simple manner, which is just to go a bit more conservative when HRV is suppressed with respect to your normal range that you collected data on, in the previous weeks, then scale down the intensity. And this can mean different things based on your level. Like if you're an elite athlete, probably you don't need to sit on the couch. You had a hard session plan, maybe you can do a moderate session, right? It's just
Mm.
about managing the stressor on the body. If you are a recreational athlete that just started and is training just a few times per week, then maybe it's good to just skip the day and then you do that session the day after. So there is room there to adjust based on your level and physiology. But the idea is really that we use the data to make these sort of adjustments. And typically it's about the intensity because the intensity is really what is causing the disruption in autonomic
Mm.
activity. If the intensity is low, typically there is no issue, even with prolonged duration, assuming that you have the fitness to handle that type of prolonged duration, then typically we do not implement changes. But if we have high intensity sessions, then it can be beneficial to reduce the intensity because basically what the suppression in HRV is telling you is that your body is not in an ideal state to respond positively and assimilate the stimulus. And we see that in
Mm.
these studies because you have, for example, two groups of people, right? One group will just do the periodization. The other group will scale down the intensity at times based on the HRV suppression. At the end of the study, the group that had to scale down the intensity sometimes overall trained less hard. It's just the way it is because the only intervention you do is to scale down the intensity
Mm.
sometimes, just when the HRV is suppressed. But then if we look at performance, this group tends to perform better or equally good, which means that you train less hard, but you haven't lost anything actually because you simply were not in a place and in a time in which you could have responded positively to that hard stimulus. I think that's a bit difficult for us sometimes to grasp. We think that we do the work and that's gonna lead us somewhere.
Mm.
But timing matters. We need to do the work when the body is ready to assimilate the stressor and respond to that positively. Otherwise, we are doing the work, but we are not getting better.
100%. And I think it goes back to that conversation of the adaptation is only available if you sleep and recover well enough. Um, so that's why I kind of wanted your take on that because, again, I've had conversations with Ali, who is in contact with each other, and he's like he in his research field, we technically still don't know what fatigue is. When we're talking about recoveries, and again, not we're not going to make adjustments all the time based on HRV scores and how that impacts performance because sometimes we just need to push or sometimes we need to just go with the program as opposed to make every shift and it comes to that flexible periodization. So when we're talking about fatigue and how the heart rate sort of adjusts to that, what is your sort of advice on kind of keeping diaries and keeping sort of a track of where you are every single morning? Although it's not always to make these adjustments, just to be conscious on how you are performing.
Yeah, I think when we look at this data, it's also important to um, distinguish between what is the actual physiology, the HRV and the resting heart rate, and how this is used by the tools that most people are using, like wearable devices and things like that, where this information is typically overinterpreted
Mm,
and used to really push people to daily actions, right? So there is a sort of a fake urgency to do something, because you need to be engaged with this device. But the reality of things is from the science of HRV and how HRV should be used and looking at resting physiology itself, these changes I was talking about earlier in terms of, for example, a suppression in HRV that shows that you have not responded well, these are rare things. If we build your normal range, so that is what your normal physiology looks like. If you're not used to using tools to track HRV, you can think about other metrics that are very common. For example, if we think about blood pressure, you know that too high or too low is not great. You need to be in this range. For blood pressure, we have population-based ranges. For HRV, we
mm,
don't. So to build this range for you, you need to collect data typically for at least a month. Say you do that, and then you know that your normal HRV is between two numbers. Now, for a change to be implemented, typically in research, we look at when your weekly HRV, so the average of the week, is outside of your normal range. So by definition, that is a rare event. It means that the vast majority of the days, if you have a tool that tracks HRV according to best practices, it will just tell you your HRV is normal. Every day is the same information. It's like quite boring because you don't have this meaningful variations outside of your normal on a daily basis. So I think coming back to what you were saying earlier, like if you have your plan and you have certain sessions, and sometimes you might also want to train in a more fatigued state and things like that. It is unlikely that you're going to do that many times when your HRV is
mm,
suppressed because it's a bit of a rare event, even though that information is typically mixed up with all sorts of things. For example, how much you moved or how much you slept to create this recovery and readiness scores that have all sort of different numbers every day of the week. But those are made up things that don't really have a place, in my opinion, in terms of guiding an athlete training. Right? It's just a consumer tool, that tries to engage the user with this sort of metrics, but it doesn't have much to do anymore with the resting physiology and the HRV and how HRV is used in research. So
mm,
from that point of view, I would say the type of adjustment you make It's not very frequently, because if we look at the data and we understand what the data is telling us, meaning when everything is normal, that's good. Stability is good. We shouldn't really aim for ever increasing metrics or things like that, because obviously that is also not long-term sustainable. So for these type of things, the ideal response is a stable response, which means data is basically always within our normal range, and you don't make adjustments of them. You typically stick to your plan. And that's how these tools, I think, can be helpful also in understanding our our plan is going, how we're responding to that, right? Obviously, if we pack too much into it, then the metrics are going to show it, right? The response will not be as good, and you will start to get more days below your normal range, for example, which typically signals more stress and this kind of things. I think it's important for people to try to look at the actual physiology and the data. That's what your body is telling you, which is
Mm,
different from the made up scores. Anyone with a wearable can try to edit their sleep time and their score will change, right? So that is clearly not linked to your physiology. It's just behavior mixing up the metric. And I don't mean that your sleep time is irrelevant, but when you measure, you see your body's response to stressors, including how you slept and your sleep time. It's already part of the output. When I measure my physiology in the morning, if I slept less, but my physiology is normal, it means that I could sleep less and it was fine. And
mm,
obviously, it also does not mean that I can do that every day, right? Maybe after 3 days in a row, then it's too little sleep and I will have a suppression. But I think that it's a bit dangerous to assume that if you sleep a bit less, then you must be less recovered, which is how these algorithms work for readiness and
mm.
recovery and all these kind of things, right? It's a deterministic relationship, right? If you sleep less, you have a lower score. Like it doesn't matter how your body handled that. So I think we need to really step back there and try to look at the actual physiology and then use that more effectively.
So you're saying that there's not really a link between sleep time and how the HRV scores would come out.
But the HIV itself will be impacted by
Hmm.
anything. But it's just not so simple that a bit
Okay.
less sleep means a worse score, right? Because that's
Okay.
what the wearables are doing. Like they are really oversimplifying a lot
Hmm.
to give you this score. And I think at a certain point that becomes detrimental. It's the same for athletes doing, I don't know, you go to a training camp, you increase your load intentionally for a while, and then you
Hmm.
use a wearable that gives you a score where also your activity level is included. And they will say, oh, you did so much activity. So again, behavior, just like sleep time, activity this time will impact the score. You did so much activity, now you must be less recovered. So automatically, deterministically, the score is lower. But the whole point of measuring your physiology is to see how you handle that increase in load. So you really want to see the physiology without the confounding effect of
Mm.
your behavior. If your physiology is normal, you're handling the load well. And again, it doesn't mean that you should always do that load. It's intentional, it's planned, it's a training camp, and, it's a stimulus you're giving to the body. But you want to see the body's response. And I think what we are losing with all these devices creating scores that combine multiple information is eventually to make it less clear how your body actually responded, because behavior is always part of these scores and is eventually confounding the data.
How can we increase the capacity for our heart rate to adapt better to different stimulus?
I think if we look at our resting physiology, resting heart rate, resting HRV as a marker of our ability to simulate stress on a given day, and we want to improve that over the very long term, I think we have the usual, I would say, main pillars of health and performance: sleep, diet, movement. And we need to look at those as ways, um, yeah, to keep things in balance and possibly trending very slowly in a good direction. There is no other long-term intervention really that has shown that we can change these metrics
Mm.
effectively as much as low intensity physical exercise, a healthy diet, and an appropriate amount of sleep. That again is highly individual, right? Probably each person knows more or less when it's a good amount and when it's too little. But those kind of factors are the ones that have the greatest impact long term. Acutely, in the very short term, other interventions have shown some changes. We looked a lot also, for example, into forms of breathing, slow breathing exercises. Some of these forms are embedded into other practices like mindfulness, meditation,
Hmm.
yoga, all sort of things that use slow breathing. I think that there the evidence is strong only in terms of the acute effect as you practice. So as you do that, there is a large physiological change that is typically gone as soon as you're done. It doesn't mean that it's not effective. There is, let's say, proven benefit from other points of view, typically from a psychological point of view, anxiety reduction, aggression reduction, improved sleep quality, all sorts of things. But it does not mean that it might change, but it will certainly change your physiology, right? Your
Hmm.
resting physiology. I think that's also highly individual. Probably people need to experiment and see what happens there. Um, but yeah, in terms of the higher level of evidence, I would always say low intensity movement, diet, and sleep. Yeah.
Hmm. What's We've kind of spoke about like different wearables and heart straps. What's your take on how that is trending, and what are some of the ones that you would recommend?
Yeah. In terms of sensors to use, there's different ways to track HRV. With the app we developed, you can use the phone camera or a chest strap or other sensors that communicate with standard protocols like a chest strap, but are maybe slightly more user friendly. There's very few actually that use standard protocols, but there are versions that you can clip to your finger or to your ear, and those are good places for optical sensing. In terms of chest straps, typically I recommend polar ones because we validated them against ECGs, and so we showed that they are very accurate, they can be trusted very well. So that's what I typically recommend. And then if you prefer not to measure fasting in the morning, so to use a different wearable, as I said earlier, I'm an advisor for Aura, but I also tested Garmin's and Whoop bands and Chorus watches as well that now do the same. All of these devices can track relatively well night HRV. So the average of the night, they're all very similar. So typically my recommendation is to pick one that works for you. For example, if you're an endurance athlete, I don't think you need to get a wearable just for this because your Garmin or your Chorus watch will already do this with
Mm.
good enough accuracy for night data, right? So those are good. You do another sport, maybe where a GPS watch is useless, then you could go, for an Oura Ring or a Whoop Band or whatever you think is the best form factor for you. All of them, from the point of view of night physiology and night heart rate and night HRV, are very similar. Again, on top of this data, they build all sorts of things, all the made up scores and so on. And we already talked about that. I think in general, they do athletes a bit of a disservice, and it's better to look at the data itself. For that reason, I think sometimes it's simpler to use an app that is built for this and allows you to track HRV. But in terms of data quality, those options are also valid for night data.
Hmm. So, what would you recommend to start to build this plan for your morning and night routine to make sure that every sort of aspect of your performance is getting tracked?
In terms of tracking HRV for the morning, I would just do a simple protocol. You wake up in the morning, then go to the restroom if you need to, go back, lie down, sit up. After 30 seconds, you take your measurement. Again, this is to exploit this orthostatic stressor. You change body position, your body needs to readjust. You measure within 30 seconds from that change. The measurement is going to be very sensitive of your stress response. It will capture better when you have a poor response to your training, for example. There's research showing that overtrained athletes could see a change in HRV when measured this way, despite no change at all in their night HRV data. So again, in a fully parasympathetic state, when you're resting, it is not as sensitive. Otherwise, you take your morning measurement and you capture that. The measurement itself can be very short. There has been also here many studies showing that just with 1 minute of data, you can get the relevant metrics. So you don't need to measure for 5 minutes like in the older days, because we don't look at certain metrics anymore that were used earlier on. Now we use this metric called RMSSD. Is also the same that you find in the wearables. And that is something that looks at high frequency changes, because that's how the parasympathetic nervous system works. So we do that, and you can do that in 1 minute. So sit up, measure for 1 minute, and you have collected your first data point. You do that every day because, again, the absolute value you capture your first day, it doesn't really tell you anything. This is not something we can compare to a population. We cannot even compare it to people similar to us, people that
Mhm.
do the same things and are the same age group, things like that. It doesn't work like that because there are strong genetic components. So our normal range or baseline, so the typical values for us, could be very different from our friends or colleagues or people that train with us and things like that. So we really need to collect the data ourselves for us for several weeks, and then we can say, okay, this what is normal for me is this is the range, and then we look at how things change on a daily basis. So that's also what you see in the HRV for training app. You would take your measurement after a few days, you start to see what is normal for you, and you see where you stand today with respect to your norm. So if you have a suppression, you will clearly see, okay, today your data is definitely below what is normal day-to-day variation for you. So that would be a good time to make some adjustments. And the adjustments, you always have two options, right? We discussed earlier. You can change the training, and in that case, it will be about reducing intensity. You might not want to do that, or might not be able to do that, right? Because it's not always so easy. It's not always so flexible, especially if you're not professionals. And not every day we can do maybe a certain session or things like that. And and the weather is different, and those sort of things have a role also, right? So in this case, we might want to try to prioritize recovery. That is the other side, right? So either we reduce training intensity or we try to push recovery on that given day. That could be trying to limit other stressors. It could be trying to add recovery, meaning, for example, maybe we try to sleep a bit more. Maybe if we have the opportunity, we take an extra nap. Maybe we can try even some slow breathing exercises or things like that, if that's something that interests you. So all sort of options that try to push recovery or limit additional strain on the body.
What's the formula that people should use to see where their heart rate variability is from nighttime to morning time?
Sorry?
So, like, what formula should be used
All right.
to better accuracy in those two measurements?
So I think for morning measurements, you have 1 minute of data, and we compute this metric called RMSSD, which is just a way to look at high frequency changes in heart rate variability. So that is, I would say, pretty standard. For night data, the best way is also to do this every 5 minutes and then average the entire night. So different wearables do this a bit differently. Some try to give more weight to certain phases of sleep and things like that. Personally, I don't like that much because we cannot detect sleep stages with very high accuracy. So eventually, we are just introducing more error if we
Mhm.
think that, okay, we are just going to look at deep sleep. But yeah, can we do that? Not really, right? We can only just guess it decently, but it's not that we can pinpoint the exact times and then look at the data at that time. And then that time is also different every night, right? It could be more or less amount of deep sleep. It could be earlier, it could be later. So I think we just add a lot of noise. So if we look at the night data, we compute again RMSSD, this index of HRV. We do that every 5 minutes for the entire night, and then we average the whole thing, and that is our HRV number. So we get this number or the morning one, and then we look at how this change over time. I don't think people
Mhm.
necessarily need to track both. It could be interesting under certain circumstances. For example, I have a Chorus watch that I use for training, for running, and that gives me night data. Then I measure in the morning the way I think is best. When I have, for example, a suppression in the morning data, that could be due again to the higher sensitivity. So maybe it's really linked to my previous training. So if I check my night data and it's fine, then it tells me that this is really about the smaller stressors. And I'm likely, for example, not getting sick. If my night data is also not good, and the morning data is not good, then I'm having to think about this a bit
Mm.
more, thoroughly, because if I had a uneventful evening and no late stress or nothing like that, but the night data is not good and the morning data is not good, then probably that is a moment in which maybe my health is not great or something bigger is going on. So it might be, sometimes just another way to look at multiple signals and try to make sense of those.
With the way that the popularity of HRV is going, what are some frustrations that you're having, and what are you trying to bring more awareness to?
Yeah, I do try. I try for sure. Also, there's another attempt. So thank you for having me here again. But
That's
I
all
would
good.
say that there is there are many oversimplifications. Some we discussed. Others, the more common one is typically the higher is better, right? So higher HIV, great. Each day that you can go out and actually really push hard and these kind of things. But this is not really how things work. For example, sometimes you have particularly high HRV, and that is pretty bad. It's as bad as having it very low, because it does not signal that your body is extremely recovered, but it signals that you are really busy trying to recover.
Mm,
And this happens often after traumatic events or accidents or even sometimes very hard races and things like that. Parasympathetic activity is very high. Heart rate is very low. HRV is very high. It does not mean at all that you should go high. So that's why I really try to stress this aspect of the normal range, stability as a good thing more than higher values. And similarly, in terms of absolute values, people measure the HRV is not a big number, and then they are all concerned about their health and everything. I think there's nothing to be concerned about there. Our understanding of these things is very limited. Healthy ranges include basically the entire range of values from a
mhm.
few milliseconds to 100 plus. So the most effective way to use this data for me is really just to look at relative changes for you over time. So when things go up and down, when they're stable, and really don't stress about the absolute value itself, and don't interpret things in very oversimplified ways, as in higher is better.
Okay. With the obviously frustrations you're having, what are some trends that you're seeing happen that you're really enjoying the process of people knowing that?
Well, I think that in general, there is more awareness, and that is great because we learn more also from people trying things and looking at the data in different settings. Because maybe in the early days, you just had the studies with athletes or with some very specific populations or young individuals or things like that. And now you get, a broader population, different sort of people, different sort of health and performance conditions or levels, and all of that allows you to understand a bit better how the data is useful or not useful in different contexts without making too many assumptions outside of the studied population, for example.
What are you currently working on that you're sort of excited for people to see the results, and what can you tell us about what you're currently working on?
Yeah, so on my end, I think over the past decade, we worked a lot on developing tools to assess physiology. So the measurement side of things, I think, is pretty good and understood and solid, even though we still can debate about, what is the best protocol and we should do, use this body position, this other body position. I think there's a lot of things that can still be improved and learned better in different settings and populations, and depending also on what is your goal. But I'm mostly also interested in seeing how we can impact the data with behavior, for example. So the things you were talking about in terms of slow breathing or other interventions that might change the data in different ways. But most importantly, I would say not just the data, but that then tracks with actual performance or health, right? Because the metric is useful if it is a proxy to those things, right? If it is tracking then performance or health or our ability to improve performance on a given day. If it is just about the metric, then we sort of lose focus and are not looking at the right thing anymore. So I think we always need to keep all of these things in mind, all the pieces, and then see how we can impact the data, use it as feedback, and see if it really tracks what we are really interested in.
With some of the behavioral changes that you're talking about, what has had the most impact in the way that you can, again, sort of keep your measurements as level as possible? I know you mentioned slow breathing, but is there any other ones that you found within either yourself or the population that you have a better impact overall, even if it's not like researched?
Yeah, yeah. So for me personally, for sure, working less. I was always a bit of a workaholic. So I think the data taught me over the years. When really stepping back, sometimes you don't see these things because they happen. You look at the data daily, but sometimes you have to look at like the last 3 years of data, and then you will see, hey, these
Mm,
periods I was really stressed with work, and you can see that the whole normal range is much lower, right? This kind of situations. So I learned to pace myself maybe a bit better from this point of view, like athletes that are trying not to overtrain, right? For most of us, it's more about not getting burnout with work and
mm,
everything else that we do. So I think from that point of view, it's always been yeah, it's been useful. And then to the main points we covered earlier, really low, I would say low intensity movement is a bit underrated, like moving
mhm.
around and walking and things. Like you don't
Slow, like
need
uphill
to,
walking
yeah,
and yeah.
yeah, you don't need to really go harder or do like just movement is good for your body, right? From a every point of view, and everything is interlinked in terms of stress, right? So stress and the way your body is processing glucose and your metabolism, it's all interconnected in the way also then these aspects and parameters change together with HRV and other markers of stress and of resting physiology. So I think those kind of things, also in the studies that we published, we could show that low intensity exercise would increase even HRV instead of just keeping it stable. And that is, I think, something that people can also use
Mm.
because it's fairly easy to do. Yeah.
100%. And in this, because it's a predominantly high performance coaches I have on, we often talk about load management, and I'm wondering what your take is. So I believe that load management shouldn't just be to decrease intensities and performance. We should look at, so say you've got a team, your starters will obviously have a higher demand on their heart rate and the load, the cumulative load that they have to have. But for me personally, to have a successful team, I also need my reserves to have the same capacities as my starters. So that includes something like after a game, if they've only had, say, 10 minutes of playing time, we will have a session planned for after the game so that they can keep up with the demands that were exerted by the starters. What's your take on that, and how what's your, essentially, what's your thoughts on increasing and decreasing that load?
Yeah, I think this context is just less explored in research, but it does make sense, even from a HRV point of view, right? So obviously, apart from the matching the load and having everyone working through the sessions and matches and things like that, still from a physiological point of view, in situation in which your physiology is in a good state to assimilate additional load, typically it would be your HRV within your normal range or in a higher part of your normal range. That could be also a situation in which the data tells you that it's good time to increase the load. I think my typical concern there is always that HRV is not the only parameter that
Mhm.
matters when
Yes,
you
yes,
do
of course.
that.
Yeah.
And as a coach, of course, that there are other limiters, even just from a neuromuscular point of view, or sort of things, right? That's why HRV can only be useful for adjustments, and the adjustment, yes, can be in both directions. But I think a coach is much better equipped to do that than someone that is approaching the technology and maybe
Mhm.
doesn't have a coach and things like that, simply because HRV itself cannot reflect some of the other
Other
performance
ones.
limiters we
Yeah.
have, right? Even just muscular soreness, right? That is the limiter for most situations. After we train hard, we're going to be sore, and typically we cannot execute the same, even if our HRV is good. HRV good at that point is great feedback because it means we handled the load well, but it does not necessarily mean that everything else is able to execute again that session. So again, based on the periodization and everything, we need to understand where we are and what we can do. But the data can tell you also in that case that it could be a good time even to do more, not just to do less. Yes.
What's the most interesting fact that you've sort of came across when analyzing and doing HRV that most people aren't aware of?
I don't know about that. I would really just keep drilling this point and keeping it very boring, which is
Hmm.
higher HRV is not better, stable HRV
Yeah.
is good. And the athletes that train the hardest, like the elite, they don't get like HRV suppressions after a hard train. Like their HRV is the most stable of all because they can handle it. They've trained many years for it,
Mm,
and their training is really fine-tuned to their ability. They don't overdo it in training, right? It's really about managing your load and going hard, but within your abilities.
yeah.
And that leads to stability. While people understand this the other way around, they think they need to smash it, and then they see the low score, and it's like a badge of honor, right? Because so it's low because I trained so hard. No, typically you overdid it, and it's not going to work well for the future.
That's interesting. That's the message that you want to keep hammering on, because I know certain athletes who they really like to talk about how high or low their scores are. Um, so for me, I'm just always like, okay, that's it's fine.
Yeah,
But to hear you say that that's like a point where you're like, actually, the most stable is the better, because that means that you're constantly able to recover
that's
adequately
right.
to keep performing. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
interesting. um, with you doing so much research on it, what are some resources that you recommend people look into? And I'm not just talking about like reading material, like um, even watching or like real practical application, um, to make sure that everyone's keeping on top of like their KPIs.
Yeah, so I think that is an area where unfortunately we either have the academic research or we have companies that are a bit stretching the what can be done with this technology. Right? For example, now you track HRV 24/7 as a marker of stress. Like, that is rather meaningless. It's not how these things work. Right? There's a million artifacts, things like that. I would say, people don't worry about that. Don't look at that. But at the same time, what are the resources that really are practical? So use these tools that people can get, and then are not just scientific papers or even books and other resources that on the topic are at this point are quite outdated because they only look at single measurements in two
Mm,
groups of people with different conditions. Are they different? It's not really about tracking longitudinally the individual in response to stresses. So there are a few people that are doing good work. There's Daniel Plus that talks about this a lot. He did his PhD recently. I mean, recently, a few years back, but on the topic. And then e-courses also through these tools. Yeah, I would try people to try to, find resources just like this podcast or others where people discuss from more from both scientific and practical point of view this
mm,
kind of technologies because there isn't really a good resource out there at the moment. We are trying to address this with three other people. We're writing, a book for athletes and coaches and everyone interested in the topic of HRV. That hopefully within a year or something like that, it's already been a year of writing. So within a year or something like that, I hope we can get that out and help a few people understand both the physiology in depth if they're interested into it, but also the practical
mm.
applicability, the applications, the case studies. So, trying to put together all the things that we discussed, but in an extensive way, in a way that is, yeah, it's not really out there at the moment, and that maybe is also one of the reasons behind the confusion.
Yeah, and I want to extend this invitation when that resource does come out. I'd love to have you back on and sort of talk about and walk through it. Because again, the science is great, but there's a lot of controlled variables that go into research. Like
Yeah.
you have to account for everything that happens and try and mitigate the unpredictability of people's lives. But in a
So
practical sense, we don't have that luxury. Like one
Yeah.
day you could be at your peak performing the best, the next day you could have an argument and that throws everything out. So I'm a big believer and advocate for if there's research to read, it has to have a practical application to athletes and how we can sort of adapt to what's happening. So the fact that you're doing that, I would love to have you again when that comes out, come on and sort of talk through and explain it. With the sort of advice that you've given, what are like some low hanging fruits to to get people started on their sort of analyzing and making sure that that KPI is sort of accounted for?
Yeah, I would say, get an app that allows you to track HRV. Start with daily tracking in the morning. Start looking at your data over time. I think the process of tracking is really about getting you more aware also of the stressors and everything you're doing, right? So that by itself often is useful. Is about also subjectively assessing how you feel. It's not really about objective data overriding your feel or telling you what to do. That's also why in the app we have subjective questionnaire where you fill in all sort of
Mm,
information about yourself, how you're feeling, and things like that. I think that is key because it's just about this self-awareness process that you get better at, and that's the best way to start and to keep
yeah.
tracking and then to learn from the data. I would say also don't implement any changes for like months. Just look at
Mhm.
how things change with respect to the stresses you face and the things you do. Just pay attention and then see if you can make later on some small adjustments and how that is reflected in the data.
Mhm. With the sort of app that you've created, how has that sort of changed the way that you and other people have implemented this minute changes over time? Because
Yeah,
again,
I would
sorry,
say,
I'll give you a little
yeah,
bit of explanation onto why I'm asking this. So, I also believe that when you have a physical diary that you write on, it kind of keeps you a little bit more accountable of your performance and how you're trending and tracking. So, I'm always very interested in that 1% of increase because, again, for high performing athletes, that 1% can mean from fifth place to gold medal. So, I'm always very interested in how coaches and practitioners are increasing that a little bit further.
yeah, for sure. I think the awareness bit is the most important, right? Just the fact that you're thinking about it, you're looking at how you're responding to stresses, and then you're trying to implement some meaningful changes. I think that is the key there. That is also why, again, I struggle a bit with how the technology went in the past few years, right? Because it seems more about the blind guidance, telling you what to do, what you cannot
Mm,
do, and yeah, everything must be automated. While that was not the idea for me, it was really about, okay, you track how you responded, and then you also track how you subjectively feel, which only you can do. It cannot be automated. You have to think about it, like,
mm.
how am I feeling, how am I performing, and how that relates to my physiology and to the stressors I face. Can I make some small changes in my behavior? So those kind of things.
Yeah, and again, I know that HRV isn't like it should be accounted for with everything else, but I've always liked the HRV model because, again, internal capacity is important, and I always talk about like if my athletes are going into a hard game, I still want them to perform the whole game and still have enough capacity for like overtime. Like I still want them to be as fresh at the start as like in overtime. So for me, HRV plays a big part because I at least want to know that I can keep pushing. And that to me is one of the most important things. So having you on a specialist in this field kind of helps solidify this thing where a stable is better than having high or low because like although you're not building the capacity but you're actually able to consistently make improvements and still recover enough to be in that range.
Yeah, exactly. And we don't have that many tools to track internal load, right? How we respond and things like that. I think that is really great information, but it's just not there. And obviously there are other ways we could try to look at this from hormonal changes and so on, but
Mhm.
it's just not feasibly possible, practical to do it at the required frequency and looking at this data. So we need to use the tools that we have. And in this context, I think if we do it right, HRV can be effective.
Mhm. What heart rate straps are um, linked with the application that you have?
So any startup that implements standard protocols would talk to the app, but I always recommend either the Polar H10 or other Polar models, and some of also the recent Garmin straps, because these ones I could test and they are all very accurate. So these ones are the ones I would recommend. Doesn't mean that others won't work, but all sensors are really developed for heart rate tracking, not for HRV tracking. So the
Mhm.
fact that you have a strap does not necessarily mean that they will send you the required data for HRV, and that is a pity, but it's just the way it is. So to remove any risk,
Yeah.
I'd say get a Polar strap or one of the new Garmin Bluetooth straps, and those work really, really well. And that's
Mhm.
also the only way to actually measure your HRV, meaning heart rate variability, right? Because all the other optical methods they will look at your pulse rate variability because obviously they measure at the periphery, right? So far from the heart, and they don't measure the electrical activity of the heart. And while the two are highly correlated, they're not always the same. The moment that blood is reaching the periphery, so the finger, the wrist, or whatever, that is also dependent on blood pressure and other parameters. So if you want to know your heart rate variability, the only way is with a chest strap.
I always get um, asked the recommendation on different devices, and I'll speak to a little bit more at the end. But again, I've throughout my university we used polars, so I'm a big fan of polar. Um, the one that I'm sort of seeing if it's worth it or not, and I know you do a little bit of work for them, but it's the Aura Ring. What's your thoughts on the metrics that's tracked there and how all the metrics that they use can be actually, do you think it's a worthwhile product to invest in?
So in terms of tracking resting physiology, I think it's great. So it is accurate to track resting heart rate and night HRV. They give you also the average of the night without messing with it, without taking subsamples in a certain sleep stage or things like that. So I like that because you can see the actual physiological response. Then, just like any other wearable, they also make all these, made up scores and readiness
Mm.
and sleep qualities and things like that. So I think the amount of information then somewhat overwhelming and not really um, linked to our physiological response anymore the way I mean it in terms of looking at the physiology and normal ranges and things like that. So is it a good device to track your resting physiology? Yes. Do you then want to use it for all sort of other things that I'm a bit more skeptical. So I would just, if it's just a convenient way to track resting physiology, then sure. But then I would always, be aware of all the made up things.
I really appreciate you for coming on today. If you let people know where they can find you and sort of reach out, if they've
Yeah,
got any
thank you so
questions or
much.
anything
And
else.
yeah. So normally I would say at this point on Substack, I've blog there where I write quite a lot about all of these things. So that would be marcoaltini.substack.com exactly. So just sign up there. Everything is free. There's no paywall, and all the content you can read it there. It's all about reliability and these kind of things. And also feel free there to comment or message me, and I'll get back to you.
Perfect. I will also put up the website where they can get that up as well.
That's right. Thank you.
No, I really, really appreciate you for coming on. I like to have on people that really know about this certain element, but can also keep it practical. So we really do appreciate you for taking time to come on.
Thank you so much.
Perfect. Peace.